Good afternoon. I'm Peter Klingman, the Mildred and Doyle Carlton Curator for the Resource Center for Florida History and Politics and the Director of the University of South Florida's Oral History Program. And this is another one of our interviews with Len Colodny, who is the donator of the material that comprises the Nixon collection in the University of South Florida Library. Len, today we're going to talk about the spy ring and how the collection supports the evidence that it existed or didn't exist during the Nixon administration. And I know that that's a pretty important subject to you from both a research point of view and perhaps in some ways in a personal point of view.
Well, it's an interesting period in time, and we're here today, January 28th, 2000. And 40 years ago, I was preparing for the New Hampshire primary with John F. Kennedy. And in those days, there were only 12 primary states. And I'm struck as we sit here today watching the candidates in the year 2000 and watching the electorate in this year versus when I was 21, 22 years old. We were passionately for John Kennedy. We weren't looking for dirt on Richard Nixon. There wasn't this back and forth. And to fully capture that era of the 60s, we were pretty naive about politics. We were weaned on Roosevelt and what government could do. And we believed that civil rights were right. We did a lot of these things as we moved toward the Nixon years. It's a much different story today as I sit and watch television and watch the candidates just try to cut each other up in any which way they can. And they're not as much forced things as they are for trying to destroy the other candidate. And as one who worked in political campaigns since Watergate, one of the first things we talk about is driving the other guy's negatives up. How do we do it? It's called opposition research, and so these were terms that. Now that isn't to say that in the 1960 campaign or in that era, when the bosses made the final decisions, really, the West Virginia primary was about could a Catholic win in a Protestant state. There were those kind of issues, but this is a totally different ballgame today, and it's a totally different ballgame because of the Nixon years, and the Johnson years, and the radical changes that began with the shooting of John Kennedy, and the murders of his brother and Martin Luther King and the Vietnam War. And Watergate sort of punctuated that era. So looking back now at my own political activity and what's going on today, even on campus, I note I saw one Bush for President bumper sticker. I don't see anybody gathering to, here we are on the eve of a primary, in Florida primary coming up next month. There's very little action on the campus. When I was this age, we were deeply and passionately involved in what we were for. So times have changed, and they've changed as a result of the Nixon years. And as we go into understanding the Nixon years, where President Nixon, who had lost to John Kennedy, or at least that's the version of history that we know, historians today pretty much believe that Nixon won that election, even though he didn't. He conceded, didn't demand a recount, didn't take it to court. It's held up as one of his shining moments that he conceded and didn't put the country through the uncertainty of who would be president. Richard Nixon, in those intervening years between 1960 defeat, the Goldwater election, and then first his run for governor, which he was defeated in California, and everyone thought Richard Nixon was dead.
Including Richard Nixon.
Absolutely, thought he was absolutely a goner. And Richard Nixon began to try and revive himself by leaving California and moving to New York and moving to the law firm of Mudge Rose, which included John Mitchell and Len Garment and people who we know of today. They welcomed him in. Once the Goldwater campaign was over, Nixon began to focus himself on the potential of the 1968 campaign, and he called the Haldeman's and Ehrlichmans of this world to come back and talk to him about it. But there was something else going on. He was also plotting foreign policy at that law firm, even though he hadn't had the nomination, and even though it was a long shot in a lot of people's mind that Nixon would be. No one could even begin to deal with the realities of the Ford Johnson years, the war, the assassinations, the riots. I mean, he didn't have any sense of that as he was looking at, but these things were happening and unfolding, and Nixon was becoming almost someone they could unite behind. Obviously it was a very close election in '60. But Nixon had a global view. And one of the things that he spent a good deal of time talking to people in his law firm about was China. China was almost the centerpiece of his world thinking. I mean, he was clearly a person who gave a lot of thought to foreign policy, seems to have given a lot more thought to foreign policy than he did to domestic policy. But this would have been a major move to China. This was not a simple foreign policy decision that you just come in and make. And Nixon realized what he would be up against as he formulated this balance of power, because that's what he really was playing. The so-called China card was meant to balance the power with the Soviet Union, so the Soviet Union wasn't totally focused on us and had to worry about our relationship with the Chinese. So it sort of became a triangle effect, and it's with us to this day. We're still arguing about what our relationship with China should be, even after the Soviet Union has collapsed. So Nixon understood that he would have to do some rather interesting things. And when he was elected, president in 1968, and had announced in his campaign that he had a secret plan to end the war, and it was a very close election. I think he won by about a point and a half. He knew he had not a mandate, but he was determined to govern, and he was determined to make this foreign policy work. And he had this balance of power in mind. If he could go to China, then he could deal with the Soviets on issues that he wanted to deal with, like the strategic arms limitation and so on.
Let's back up to two things that I think may be important here in what you've just said. One is that Nixon was present when, quote-unquote, China was lost. And that was a very important element of his understanding of how the world worked, I suspect. I mean, he was part of the McCarthy era, was there when Mao Zedong took over and the nationalists had to go to it. So I think he probably did understand, playing the China card as you described it, and as that term was used as I remember it as well, that if he was going to do that, it was going to be a very strong and difficult issue, as the loss of China had been in the first place. And I think that's one element of the issue. The second is a question. In your research on this issue, have you encountered, and does the collection itself address, that prior to 1968 that he had any discussions with Henry Kissinger about this whole thing that would eventually be called linkage between playing China off against the Soviet Union and so on and so forth? Do you know if that occurred?
No, it not only didn't occur, but at the time Henry Kissinger was leaning toward the Democrat side. In that time frame, he was working for the Pentagon on the Pentagon Papers. He was an advisor from time to time for Hubert Humphrey. He didn't even meet Richard Nixon until after Nixon was elected president in November, December of 1968. So the this myth that Kissinger somehow was the guiding genius behind all this is just not true. Richard Nixon was Richard Nixon's own Secretary of State.
Do you have a guess, or do you know who he was talking to?
Talking to John Mitchell. He was talking to John Ehrlichman. He was talking to Bob Haldeman, a very, very small, tight group who knew that that was where he was headed. It was probably numbered no more than 6, 7 people.
None of whom would be recognized as a foreign policy expert.
No, because Nixon was his own foreign policy expert. What Nixon was plotting and planning with these people was, how do I get around the hurdle? How do I get over that hurdle? What apparatus is it going to take for me to govern? He knew that and believed that the bureaucracy was against him, that it was loaded with Democrats who were left over from other administrations. He believed that the national security apparatus would not go down real well with them. He also had firmly, I think, in his mind, I can't prove this, that he had already, in his secret plan to end the war was really Vietnamization, which he would announce in October of '69. So I think he had formulated it. I think what he was now doing was putting his team together, this very tight-knit team, and going back to his Eisenhower years, determining how to use the National Security Council to carry out policy rather than to be just a conveyor of information coming in. He knew from his Eisenhower years that it was a nerve center for all intelligence information between all the major agencies, defense, state, CIA, all the various intelligence agencies. And it was a filter. It was really meant for a different purpose. It was meant so the president didn't have to deal with competing interests one-on-one. He would get it funneled through his national security advisor. And so it had never been considered a very strong office. I mean, George Bundy was in it in the Kennedy years and the Johnson years. But everybody knew the president made the decisions, or believed that. In this case, Nixon was looking for an apparatus, and that became the apparatus. So the small group, which consisted then, Kissinger moves in, and his deputy, Haig, moves in, and Mitchell and Haldeman and Ehrlichman. But we're now talking about a very small number of people literally running the government out of there. And so that's what he was doing in December of '68. He was putting together what are called DDDSs, directives, presidential secret directives, that would mold and change the nature of that office so that he could maneuver it.
Even before he actually took the oath?
Before he took the oath. He was, in November and December, he was actually planning to issue these upon the day he took office. And he was talking to Mitchell about it, and he was talking to Kissinger once Kissinger was hired and on board. I think Kissinger came as a recommendation from Nelson Rockefeller. He didn't know him. So Kissinger comes on board, and now you have a very select few who know the real foreign policy as opposed to the perceived foreign policy. Nixon, the anti-communist. Nixon, the 50s Red Baiter, the Alger Hiss case. He had tremendous anti-communist credentials, and I think he believed that would serve him well as he did this.
Nixon's first Secretary of State was Bill Rogers. Where did he fit into this prior planning before the oath?
Well, he had been Attorney General under the Eisenhower administration, and he became very friendly with Nixon. And he essentially became the front man. He was not involved in the policy, didn't know what the policy was, but he was there to at least put a face to the Congress on foreign policy, and so he was sort of out of the loop, and it served him well. I mean, that was the purpose. It was a cover for what was really going on. And with Rogers not knowing what was going on, there's no way he could go to the Hill when he would have to go for confirmation, or when he would go up there for budgetary things or on specific issues. He'd say what he knew, and it wasn't much. And that was true of Melvin Laird, who he picked for Secretary of Defense. He didn't even particularly like Laird, but he picked Laird because Laird had good relations on the Hill. And so, as an example, he could go up and straight face say this is what we're doing, and not in any way know exactly what the heck's going on down here. And that was, so you had two key departments that are not really plugged in. The heads are not plugged in. The policy is being run, but it's being run through what's called back channels. And back channels are both intelligence channels, meaning the actual mechanical type thing or technical type thing, and they're people who are carrying messages back and forth. So there's a whole lot going on that the people who are cabinet members just don't know about. And it really, you can begin to sense the kind of frustration that would be as the years went on, as they would learn in the newspapers what was going on. It really was a very, very difficult thing, but it was part of the Nixon plan.
What do you think, Len, I'm talking pre-oath still, during the campaign, where the talk of the secret plan to get out of Vietnam, that I remember, but certainly there was no discussion about China, none whatsoever. What do you think, based on what the interviews that you've had with Haldeman and Ehrlichman and whomever else in the collection, what was in Nixon's mind as a reason for the whole idea of the policy change toward China?
Well, I think two things. One, in the collection is John Ehrlichman's novel, The China Card, which is really the story of the pre-presidential Nixon wheeling and dealing, talking about China and his thinking on China. So that's really a good book to go to, realizing it's a novel, but it's really a cover for what was happening in that 64 to 68 period and what the president's thinking was as he approached the election and then assuming office. So, no, nobody was going to talk about China. That certainly wouldn't be a plus for him. That's a Democrat who might want to have an opening to China. So he didn't talk about that. He didn't talk about a lot of things. As you may recall, back in the '60 campaign, in the debate, which, by the way, was a real debate on issues, unlike the ones we see today where Nixon was for things against things. One of the key issues was Quemoy and Matsu, the islands off of China, and what would happen if the Chinese tried to take those islands. And Kennedy ended up taking the position, one position, Nixon another position. So Nixon's position was still hard line in 1960, at least his public position on Quemoy and Matsu. And then there was the issue of the invasion of Cuba, in which Nixon really feels he was betrayed by the CIA at that time, which also affects his thinking as he goes to the '68 presidency, because he believed that Kennedy was tipped off to the what would be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, when Nixon was actually in charge of planning that thing back in the Eisenhower years. And it forced him in the debate to take a position opposite of what he knew the Eisenhower position secretly was, and Kennedy apparently knew and took the position that the administration had, which again affects the thinking as he goes into his secret government, as he begins to use the NSC as his way to conduct policy around the CIA. And so you have Laird, who he doesn't particularly like but has good congressional relations. You have Rogers, who's his good friend, and he knew would be willing to sit there and be a good soldier. If anything came out, he wasn't going to attack Nixon. And then he did another strange thing. He doesn't like Helms, and Helms doesn't like him, Richard Helms of the CIA, the head of the CIA, but he doesn't want to shake up the CIA at this point because he's got his plans. So we'll just leave him in place. We're not going to use him anyway. And so we now have at least the seeds planted around the government of people who are not really clued into what he's doing. And each one thinking the other one has his ear, because where's he getting this information from? And so you have the power blocks, the secretaries, then you have the Joint Chiefs, then you have the intelligence community. And all of them are out of the loop. And they don't even know what the loop is. That's part of the problem. They're seeing things happen, but they don't know why they're happening. And it begins almost immediately upon taking office. He makes a very profound decision, one which probably, in my judgment, of all the things you could have impeached him for, was probably the most significant thing, was the secret bombing of Cambodia. I mean, here you've got a Secretary of Defense that doesn't know, has no idea that we're bombing Cambodia. And that's good for Nixon, because when he goes on the Hill, when Laird goes up on the Hill, Laird isn't going to say anything. If he's asked, he don't know, he doesn't have a clue as to what's going on. Nixon is actually going around the chiefs, around Laird to the chiefs, and issuing orders. So think about this for a minute. Now the chiefs know that the Secretary of Defense, their boss, is out of the loop.
Right.
And that's important to understand what kind of thinking that meant to them. Wait a minute, we had a president who isn't following the chain of command. He isn't giving the orders to Laird, he's giving them directly to us. And of course then when Bill Beecher of the New York Times explodes by telling us, hey, we're secretly bombing Cambodia, surprise to Mel Laird. Of course, Mel Laird tells me he was in the loop, but he wasn't in the loop.
One of the things that's interesting about what you're saying, just in a general term, is it's hard for me, and I think it would be hard for anybody, to truly imagine how anybody keeps a secret in Washington to begin with, because of all the media today, at least, and all of the leaks and all of the politicians trying to get exposure, favorable relationships with the press, and on and on and on. And yet what you're describing is that a president of the United States can give military and foreign policy orders to a very small select group of people that sort of have to work down somewheres into a bureaucracy, and yet nobody talks. That's a little hard to understand.
Because there are assumptions being made by the people carrying out the orders. The assumption is the boss is in. Obviously, the people doing the bombing had no reason to believe that Secretary of Defense Laird didn't issue the order. Same thing with foreign policy. When they would meet secretly with a back channel, they had no reason to believe that Rogers wasn't involved in the loop. And I mean, that's there's two sides to this NSC thing. One, it's tremendously unconstitutional what he was doing. I mean, the Congress is sitting there, they're out of the loop.
Right.
All these the balance that we have in our Constitution of the three branches of government, they're out of the loop of this secret government that's operating. And their only defense is they can't take the president head on, so leaks become the way they destroy policy. And so the Beecher leak is no surprise. Somebody knows there's something wrong going on here, and they're not in favor of bombing Cambodia. They may have wanted to bomb Haiphong or bomb somewhere in North Vietnam. They didn't want to spread the war into Cambodia. And if that was part of his secret plan, that didn't seem real good. The other thing he wasn't doing is he wasn't giving them manpower. And by the time we get to October of '69, he's making a speech in which he literally says his plan to get out is Vietnamization, which means we withdraw and replace our troops with ARVN troops, which are the South Vietnamese Army troops. And that's a real dubious thing. And the military, again, they're not consulted because they want more men. They want to win the war. They don't want to get out. Senator Aiken, who prior to Nixon's election had suggested we just declare victory, Senator Aiken of Vermont said, oh, we'll declare victory and leave. Well, this was a form of that. This was, everything's under control. The South Vietnamese could do it. The problem was our casualty rates were going up. And we were bleeding our way out. And this wasn't sitting well with the Joint Chiefs and with the people in the national security apparatus. And so the Joint Chiefs think the CIA has his ear, and they're the ones giving him the idea to move troops out. They don't know about the secret government or the master plan for the secret government. They see pieces of it, but they haven't put it together yet. And so as we move through the first year of the Nixon presidency, we've got Kissinger, we have a Colonel Haig over in here. Mel Laird tells me the story in the collection. You'll hear him talk about how he warned John Mitchell that within the National Security Council there was a liaison office for the Pentagon. So the Pentagon had an admiral sitting in the basement where the secret operation is going on. Now, Laird doesn't know that, but he knows enough from having been on the Hill, the gossip that comes out of these kinds of things, and he warns Mitchell that they ought to get rid of this little liaison office because all they were doing was undercutting him at the Pentagon because they knew certain things and then they passed it on, and he just thought it would hurt Nixon in the end. Now, that's his. I don't know if that was really his position at the time. Mitchell seems to recall it, but not as strong as Laird recalls it. Obviously, Laird was probably right. It was a very, very difficult thing. So what you have, if you can imagine a big room in the basement of the White House, which is where the National Security Council is located, you have the guts of the National Security Council, its director and staff. But in one room, you have this little room which is controlled by the military, and one admiral and a secretary. And you have General Haig, or then Colonel Haig, who's a military man. So you really have the makings now for at least some exposing of what's going on. And that's certainly appears to be what's going on here, that as things become known, they can't take them on head on because it would mean a direct challenge to the president. So what they do is they leak. And that's the kind of thing, the Beecher leak is just an example of what happened. At that point, Roger Morris and Tony Lake, who would later become National Security Advisor to Bill Clinton, did the honorable thing. They said, it's been nice, Mr. Kissinger, and we'll see you. You know, we're not a part of this. So Morris and Lake just sort of say, the heck with this. They did something that never happens in Washington, quit over principle. And they walk out on that issue. And then not knowing there's a secret government, but just knowing, hey,
something's wrong.
Hey, how could it be that we were doing this and the National Security Council don't know anything about it? So it begins, the seeds of distrust are now planted, and they're planted in all those areas we talked about earlier.
Right.
And now, for every action, there's a reaction, and the reaction is beginning.
Okay, before we get to the spy ring reaction, let's stop and go back through what you've just talked about and establish in the collection the places or the interviews or the subject matters that give evidence and testimony to what we've just talked about. Where would somebody go? You mentioned Ehrlichman's book as an example of thinking on the China card. Is there any other things that stand out?
The best book on the subject is The Price of Power by Seymour Hersh. Clearly, Seymour Hersh did his best work, better than My Lai, better than anything he's done since, in fleshing out what, of course he's talking about Kissinger, The Price of Power, but he really describes it in vivid detail, all these events that are going on, and it really gives you a feel for the texture. Silent Coup deals with the end product of what happened. He deals with how it all got underway and what was really going on. He covers the spy ring, but he's never able to come to a firm conclusion. He's pretty much sure it happened, but the smoking gun isn't there. It's always kind of washed away by, oh, it's the normal kind of thing, information. And that's true. In a bureaucracy like the Pentagon and the White House, sure, they share information with their colleagues, which they have, that crosses their desk. That's a far cry from where we're going to end up in this thing. So if I were going to recommend a book, the Ehrlichman book clearly shows that Nixon is well into his China policy long before he's even nominated and elected. The book, the Hersh book, takes us from his election on and the building of this secret government.
Did you ask any of the people that you interviewed about this?
Yeah, we'll certainly talk to John Mitchell about it. He told me how limited the knowledge was, particularly of China, to 5-6 people. And it was, we didn't know about it. The fact is we didn't know about it. Kissinger goes to Pakistan, allegedly has a bad cold or pneumonia and is laid up for 6-7 days, and then he suddenly reappears and, oh, by the way, I was in China. So the press didn't get it. Talk about secrets. That was certainly as well-kept secret as I can think of, which proves you can keep secrets in Washington, and you do keep secrets in Washington.
Did Mitchell, in your interview hours with Mitchell or with Haldeman or with Ehrlichman that you had, did they ever indicate to you that they wished that they could have convinced Mr. Nixon there was a better way to do this than by secret fiat?
No, they liked it.
They liked it.
They liked it. Hey, things got done. Policy got implemented this way. There's no question in my mind that John Mitchell wouldn't go back and redo it. John Mitchell wished he'd have known more than he knew, and if you're in the collection, particularly the years 85 to 87 interviews, are almost entirely focused on the bad outcome. In fact, they were sowing the seeds of their own destruction. And he ends up calling it a cabal that did him in. He believed Admiral Moore at the time that there was no spy ring. Admiral Moore came to the Justice Department and he looked him in the eye and said, Admiral, no, 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 no. And but then he said something curious to me, and that was that he, in the later stages, and Mitchell, in the early stages of the interviews, would never, ever say an unkind word about Richard Nixon. This is a loyal guy. This is a guy who was going to defend Nixon right to the end. But as we went through the process, as you listen to these tapes, you're going to see a change, a sea change. And you can kid him about Nixon. And at one point he says to me, Len, being on the Moore event, I was set up. Nixon set me up. He knew. See, he didn't know it was for real, because Nixon never told him it was for real. So this was a show that happened. Moore comes down, doesn't confront Nixon, but confronts Mitchell. It's part of Nixon's plan to keep the chiefs under his whip hand. So he'd made the decision to cover it up. Now all he needed was somebody that Moore could go and say, I didn't do it to, who would be credible. And Mitchell was credible at the Department of Justice, his closest ally in the cabinet. And so that was how they got out of it. That's how Nixon was able to dodge having to deal with Moore. He just shipped him over to Mitchell. Mitchell and Moore remained friends up to the time of 1986-87, when Mitchell learned for sure it had happened, and then there was a strain. But yeah, it's clear to me that they had no problem with what they were doing. They liked what they were doing, and they really saw accomplishments. And it's hard to argue with them. The accomplishments, the litany of accomplishments of the secret operation are enormous and profound. They're so profound that they have major effects on us today. China being certainly the most profound geopolitical move Nixon ever made, and certainly contributed to the downfall of the Soviet Union and to how Reagan could operate and others would operate in the future. That was certainly one thing. But then there was SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I. Then came détente, which was a constant trying to open the door. While he was secretly opening the door to China, he was overtly trying to deal with the Soviets. The ABM Treaty was certainly a major accomplishment through his secret operations. And so when you step back, these are major foreign policy triumphs without going the traditional route.
But eventually, in the case of SALT, ABM, détente, those things are in fact public. This issue that you have set up here, which we know what the reaction will be and we'll begin discussing, the secret government issue being generated over a desire to reestablish a relationship with China, thought about before he even takes office, discussed with a very small group of people before he becomes president, not mentioned in a campaign, is unlike all those other things. It is something that remains a secret. That's a very hard thing to understand in light of the fact that there were the same people doing public things, and this very small group of people were also celebrities, if you will, when they come into the office of the president. Mitchell, certainly a public figure, so is Haldeman, Ehrlichman. But this one issue of the secret government function aimed at China continues to remain a secret.
Well, it's true that China remained a secret till the ultimate moment.
Right.
But the others started out secret. The groundwork for all those other ones were done around the bureaucracy, whether it was SALT or détente or whatever. The back channels were at work, laying the groundwork. So when they became public, the groundwork had already been done. Nixon's fear is when you start a policy, getting it sabotaged before you can get it off the ground. These policies just sort of lifted. One of the things that while he was talking about Vietnamization and everything else, what he wasn't telling the military is that Henry Kissinger and friends were having secret talks with the North Vietnamese.
Right.
And they would only learn that through their spy operation, which would only become bigger and bigger as they began to understand the dimensions of what they didn't know. So when you look at it from that point of view, yes, as they rose to public view, what you didn't see was the early stages, which could have been undercut had they been known publicly. And you'd have had congressionals screaming, particularly from right-wing Republicans, saying, hey, wait a minute, we elected an anti-communist, and what the heck's he doing? He's bleeding us out of the war on one hand, and the treaties, we're voting for treaties that we don't really have our heart in, we think we should be building up. And we'll talk about this later, but the flip-flop that comes when the next Republican administration comes in after Gerald Ford and just tears it all apart.
Right. All right, Len, let's start talking about the reaction to this secret government, which in fact is a spy ring led
Well,
by the military
at the highest level.
at the highest level,
Very highest level.
against the President of the United States.
But I think in order to understand why they did it, let me go to Admiral Zumwalt, who just passed away. Nobody has described it better than Admiral Zumwalt has. From his book On Watch, which we have the appropriate excerpts in the collection, he goes on to say, and I will use his words because I think you need to understand this mindset to understand what's going to follow, why they really believe this. He goes on to say, what is important to the record is the inextricable relationship the Nixon administration's perversion of the policy-making process bore to its ignoble outlook. Its contempt for the patriotism and intelligence of the American people, for the constitutional authority of the Congress, and for the judgment of its own officials and experts reflected Henry Kissinger's worldview that the dynamics of history are on the side of the Soviet Union, and that before long the USSR will be the only superpower on earth and the U.S. will be an also-ran. That a principal reason this will happen is that Americans have neither the stamina nor the will to do the hard things they would have to do to prevent it from happening. The duty of policymakers, therefore, is at all costs to conceal from the people their probable fate and proceed as cleverly and rapidly as may be to make the best possible deal with the Soviet Union while there's still time to make any deal. The political military policies of the Nixon administration flowed quite logically from that view of the world, which the President certainly went along with whether or not he arrived at independently of Kissinger. I think what I learned during the 4 years in the thick of that miasma made it my duty to write a book. Those are powerful, powerful words coming from the Chief of Naval Operations, a ally of Thomas More, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. If you have that perception of what's going on, if that's what you've arrived at, that what you have is literally a traitor in the Oval Office, that I think is not too strong a language for what he's saying here, and what would motivate them to believe they needed to know more about the person that they believed was selling us out to the Soviet Union.
Okay, so it's quite obvious, and I think we can say in one sentence, both agree to it and move on to the details. This is a frightening concept, that the military, in fact, could engage in an unconstitutional and an illegal activity against the Commander-in-Chief, written in the Constitution. Having said it, that's not where I want to focus. Who are we talking about? Who are the people at the highest level in the military, and how do we know?
Well, first of all, let's sketch out what's going on at this point so we're in chronological order. I don't want to get out of chronological order because we'll end up having to back up anyway. The policies were going on, and there was sort of an internal war as they learned about some of these policies to leak them. And in the 69-70 era, particularly in 1970, Jack Anderson suddenly became the repository of a load of leaks as we moved to 1970-71. That was one way they hoped to slow Nixon down. In other words, if you make it public what's going on, there'll be, you know, even if it's a source said or a secret document leaked. So they did have at least, while they were trying to gain information, they were also trying to do something about the information they were gaining, the knowledge they were gaining. So leaks became, and Bill Beecher being one, and Jack Anderson being another. One famous Beecher leak was while Nixon was secretly negotiating the SALT agreement. Beecher suddenly got our backup position, which they really hated, and which they leaked to Bill Beecher, and Beecher then, of course, printed the story, and Nixon was infuriated. I mean, this was just, to him, this was treason. So we got, one group thinks there's treason in the Oval Office, the other one thinks there's something treasonous going on in the bureaucracy. So you have certainly a misunderstanding between the two sides. But so while the spy ring is building in in 1970, Bob Woodward, who was over at the Pentagon at the time, and going to the White House to brief, as he was leaving, a yeoman was coming, and Yeoman Radford. And Yeoman Radford's story is he's a Mormon, he's a patriot, and he went to work in that little office in the White House, in the basement of the White House. And his commanding officer eventually became an Admiral Wellender, again of Woodward's former commanding officer on the USS Fox. He was literally told and trained to do a number of things. Every day he would go through the burn bags. Burn bags being the secret documents, eyes-only documents that get burned every day so that they stay eyes-only secrets. Drafts of letters to the president, drafts of letters back, all kinds of material. He would also go, when they went to lunch, he'd go through the inboxes, the outboxes. And there was also another individual in the mailroom, because the mailroom was really the nerve center. That's where everybody was sitting there, courier after courier coming in. So they had a military guy there who was feeding Radford. Everybody else, unbeknownst to them, was feeding Radford. But more importantly, they were grooming him to go on these trips. And so they got him in with General Haig. And so when Haig would make a trip, that's how they learned about the North Vietnamese.
But I need to stop you for purposes of the tape. Who's the they? Who are
they
the
are
people?
Admiral Moore is running the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is running the show. He has the sympathy, obviously, of Admiral Zumwalt, who's his compatriot, who replaced him as Chief of Naval Operations. Admiral Wellender is certainly one of the players. The yeoman we can hardly call a major player, but he certainly is the guy who...
He's the principal actor.
He's certainly the guy that's carrying out...
He's doing the deed.
Carrying out the deed.
Right.
And the irony of all this, I mean, he's on these key trips. So, and he talks about how Haig would get drunk or fall asleep, and then he could steal from Haig's briefcase. And it's always been my feeling that was an attempt to see how good he was, because it was Haig who got him on the trip, the famous China trip, and got him to go with as Kissinger's aide, and he sold him as a, he's a male and he can type and so on. And so he was trained to steal, and in fact, when he took this trip with Kissinger, he stole so much stuff, he had to send them in pouches back to get it back to the United States, in diplomatic pouches. And so he was a full-fledged, that's all he did. And as he told us, the object was to knock off the president. That was his interpretation of what his orders, what he was involved in.
His interpretation.
And he had a very strange relationship. His parents, who are Mormons, had met Jack Anderson, who was a Mormon, and struck up a relationship. And in one of the strangest of all things, he looks Anderson up. He doesn't even know who Anderson is. He doesn't know he's a columnist in all these newspapers, and he's printing all these leaks. And Anderson owns a Chinese restaurant. They get together and they go to dinner at a Chinese restaurant. He comes in the next morning to tell Admiral Wellender, Admiral, I had dinner with Jack Anderson last night. Jeez, Well, you'd have thought the world was going to come to an end, but it didn't. They didn't discourage the relationship at all. In fact, all they said was just don't tell him anything. And not knowing anything, not knowing particularly that Anderson was the source of where leaks were going on, and in the collection I interview Anderson and ask him, where he getting these leaks from a yeoman? No, he's getting them from admirals. He ain't getting them from he's not getting them from. So you have this strange dynamic. Normally, that would be a national security risk. Why wouldn't you say to him, don't you ever to go see Anderson? I mean, we don't want you associating. You know too much. You're in a very sensitive job. Right. Instead, they encourage him, keep doing it, just don't tell him anything.
Question. Zumwalt, Wellender, Moore. Do you have any evidence that they met on a regular and frequent basis? Did they, in your interviews with them, and how did they describe their relationships with each other vis-a-vis Yeoman Radford? I mean, did they have briefings with him? Did he just report to one of them? Did all three men know the same things? What is your sense of how that worked, and what does the collection tell us?
Well, I think we ought to rely on Admiral Wellender. I think in order to get to the answer to that question, we have to explain why we now know that, who talked to who.
Right.